The small, trembling girl tried to hold back her tears as Nandy stood over her, an amused smile creeping across her face. Nandy, the daughter of a powerful senator, seemed larger than life in the dimly lit corridor. She didn't even have to raise her voice. Everyone knew that if you crossed her, things would only get worse. Teachers, students, and even the principal feared her. She wasn't just another rich girl. She was untouchable, or so everyone thought. From the moment she stepped into Njomba Secondary School, Nandy made it her territory. Her parents, especially her father, the senator, were known for their wealth and influence across the city. Nandy loved to remind everyone that they were mere nobodies compared to her. She walked through the halls like she owned the school, her high heels echoing with each step, and everyone parted to make way for her, too scared to even glance in her direction. Nandy's control wasn't just over the students. Even the teachers and school staff were afraid. They saw what happened to those who dared to defy her. One day, while the teacher was delayed, Nandy turned her gaze to another girl in the class who looked at her, a quiet girl named Adamma. With a sly smile, Nandy walked over and grabbed Adamma by the arm, pulling her toward the corner of the room. Everyone started whispering, confused and worried, asking each other what's going on. Before anyone could figure it out, Nandy suddenly pushed Adamma hard. She stumbled, her books falling from her hands, and landed on the floor with a thud. The whole class went silent, holding their breaths as they watched. The air was heavy with tension as Aken watched, his heart pounding in his chest. But he couldn't ignore the sight of his twin sister Adamma, just a few rows away, surrounded by Nandy. Nandy's sharp mocking voice pierced the room. "Why were you staring at me? Your hair looks terrible," Nandy sneered, twirling a pair of silver scissors in her hand. "It's so filthy and messy. And with that short cut, you look like a boy. Maybe I should just shave it all off." Adamma's face turned red, her hands clutching the edge of her blazer. She tried to laugh it off at first, her soft voice trembling, hoping Nandy would get bored and move on. But Nandy's smile only grew wider, her eyes glinting with something dark. She gripped a fistful of Adamma's hair and pulled hard, yanking her hair back. The other students froze, their laughter fading. No one dared to move, their eyes darting between Adamma and Nandy, afraid of becoming Nandy's next target. They sat there, some biting their lips, others hiding their faces behind textbooks, too scared to speak up but horrified by what they were witnessing. Adamma winced, trying to hold back tears as Nandy held her hair tightly. "Nandy, please, let me go," she whispered, her voice shaking. But Nandy just laughed, and with a sudden wicked grin, she brought the scissors close to Adamma's scalp. Snip! A small lock of Adamma's hair fell to the floor. "What's the matter? Afraid?" Nandy mocked, snipping away more hair with each word. She was so close to Adamma's face that her breath brushed against her skin. "You want to look like a boy, right? So let's make sure everyone sees you as one." Aken clenched his fists, his whole body trembling with anger. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his classmates, hoping someone would step in. But everyone else was looking away, pretending not to notice. He couldn't believe they would all sit there, watching his sister's humiliation like it was some twisted show. And then, Nandy tugged on Adamma's hair one last time, slicing off a larger chunk. Adamma bit her lip, the tears now spilling over as she held in a sob, her shoulders shaking. Aken's vision blurred with rage. "Enough, Nandy," Aken shouted, standing up so quickly his chair nearly fell over. "Leave her alone." The room went silent. Nandy slowly turned, still holding the scissors, her gaze shifting to Aken, a smirk twisted on her face. "Oh, or what, Aken?" she taunted, waving the scissors in his direction. "You think you can do something about it? Without thinking, Ekene stormed forward, determined to take those scissors from her. His hands shot out, grabbing for the silver blades, but Nandy pulled back, laughing as she dodged him, holding the scissors out like a weapon. She swung the scissors toward him, and in the struggle, the sharp edge grazed his hand, a thin line of red appearing on his skin. But Ekene didn't care. He was tired of the fear, tired of the silence. He managed to grab the scissors, yanking them from her grip and tossing them onto the floor, his chest heavy. At that moment, the door opened, and Mrs. Obiajulu, their literature teacher, walked in. She stopped, looking between Ekene and Nandy, who was breathing hard, glaring at him with fury. Adamma, meanwhile, was sitting slumped at the corner, her face hidden as she wiped her tears and pulled a hoodie over her head to cover the uneven tufts of hair. Mrs. Obiajulu scanned the scene, her face unreadable. But after a brief pause, she simply walked to the front of the room, placing her books on the desk. Everyone, settle down. Let's begin today's lesson. A tense silence fell over the class. The students took out their textbooks. Ekene's paws raced as he stared at her, his face twisted in confusion and anger. He raised his hand slowly, his voice respectful but firm. "Ma, how can you just ignore this? You saw what she did to my sister." Mrs. Obiajulu's gaze remained fixed on her open book. She took a deep breath, then glanced at Ekene with a cold, almost warning look. "Ekene, sit down. This is not the time for disruptions. Let's continue with the lesson." Ekene felt a sharp pang of betrayal, a sense of hopelessness clawing at him. He couldn't believe it. Even Mrs. Obiajulu, who he had once thought was fair and just, was ignoring his sister's suffering, letting Nandy go unpunished. Nandy returned to her seat, giving Ekene a triumphant smile. She didn't need to say anything. Her smug expression said it all. She leaned back in her chair, flashing a mocking look at Ekene, her eyes glinting with cruelty. The lesson continued, and Ekene sat down, barely able to process what had just happened. His sister sat beside him, her face hidden beneath her hoodie, her shoulders trembling as she tried to hold back her sobs. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that he would protect her somehow, even if no one else would. The next day, Nandy hadn't let go of her grudge. As Ekene passed her, she slyly stretched out her leg just as he walked by. Caught off guard, Ekene stumbled and fell hard, his knees scraping against the rough floor, his books flying out of his hands. Pain shot through his lip as he bit down, and warm blood started trickling down his chin, staining his shirt. A few students nearby who hadn't seen what Nandy did burst out laughing at the sight of Ekene sprawled on the ground. Ekene stood up, dusted himself off, and looked straight at Nandy, his eyes burning with both pain and anger. Just as he opened his mouth to ask why she had tripped him, Nandy slapped him sharply across the face. A few students gasped while others laughed, mocking Ekene for being hit by a girl. But before he could think twice, Ekene's hand shot out and he slapped Nandy back. The force of his hand sent her stumbling backward until she hit the opposite wall of the corridor. She looked at him in shock, her face red with embarrassment and fury as the students around them fell silent. Realizing what he had done, Ekene felt his heart race with regret and confusion. This wasn't him. He wasn't a person who hit others, especially women, but Nandy had pushed him past his breaking point. Feeling the sting of what had just happened, he quickly fled to the bathroom, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. He splashed cold water on his face, his hands shaking as he tried to calm down. Guilt crept into his heart. He had defended himself, but the way he had done it troubled him. After a while, a voice came over the loudspeaker, calling him to the principal's office. Ekene's heart sank as he walked down the corridor, his mind racing with fear of what would come next. When he entered the office, his worst fears were realized. Nandy's father, the senator, was standing there, his face flushed with rage, while Nandy sat on the office chair, her hand still pressed to her cheek, looking both humiliated and triumphant. The principal looked tense, his eyes darting nervously between Ekene and the senator, who seemed ready to explode. The senator's voice was sharp as he turned to the principal. "I expect you to handle this matter immediately and discipline this boy like the rat he is. My daughter deserves respect, not violence." Ekene felt a lump in his throat. He looked down, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on him. The principal cleared his throat, avoiding Ekene's gaze as he turned to him with a serious expression. "Ekene," he said slowly, "I need you to kneel before Nandy and apologize right now. Your actions were unacceptable." Ekene's heart pounded. Kneel? Apologize to Nandy? After everything she had done to him, to his sister, to countless other students? He felt a surge of defiance rise within him. He knew this was wrong. He looked at the principal and shook his head, his voice steady and clear. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I won't kneel before her." The senator's face turned red with fury, and he stepped forward, his voice cold and biting. "If you don't kneel and apologize this instant, you will regret it, boy. Do you understand? You will regret it." Ekene met his gaze, feeling his knees shake but refusing to give in. "I'm sorry, but I can't. I won't apologize for standing up to her." Just then, Ekene's mother was ushered into the principal's office. She realized what was going on immediately, her eyes pleading as she approached him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Ekene, please, just ask for forgiveness. Let's end this." He looked into his mother's eyes, feeling the weight of her worry and desperation. She was scared for him. He could see that, but something deep inside him wouldn't allow him to bow down to Nandy. Not this time. Not for this. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't." His mother looked at him, her eyes filling with tears, and took a step back, defeated. She knew he had made up his mind, and the room grew tense with silence. The senator clenched his jaw, looking at the principal with a look of pure fury. The principal, caught between the senator's power and Ekene's firm refusal, finally sighed, his voice tight with fear and frustration. "Ekene, you leave me no choice. You are hereby expelled from this school, effective immediately." The words hit Ekene like a punch to the stomach. Expelled? For standing up to a bully? He glanced at his mother, whose face was streaked with tears, her hands pressed to her mouth in shock. His heart ached, but he felt a strange sense of peace as well. He had done the right thing, even if it cost him everything. As he turned to leave, he heard Nandy's mocking voice behind him. "Good riddance, Ekene. I told you no one stands up to me and wins." Ekene didn't look back. Ekene walked out of the school gate, his mother beside him, his face pale and his eyes red with tears. She walked quietly at first, but as they got further from the school, she finally spoke, her voice heavy with pain and frustration. "Ekene," she whispered, almost to herself, "what are you going to do now? Do you realize what you've done? All the dreams I had for you and Adamma, for a future better than mine. Do you understand what you've thrown away?" Ekene looked at her, his heart sinking at the sight of her tear-streaked face. She had always worked hard, taking on 2 jobs just to make sure he and his sister could go to the best school, that they would have a chance to live a life she never had. She was a cook during the day and cleaned offices at night, rarely getting more than a few hours of sleep. Her hands were rough, her back often ached, and yet she smiled every morning as she sent them off to school. "Mama," Ekene began softly, but she shook her head, wiping her eyes with the edge of her scarf. "You just threw it all away, Ekene," she said, her voice shaking. "One moment of pride, of foolishness. Now you have no school, no future. How could you let something so simple ruin everything? Do you know how many sleepless nights I've had to make sure you and Adamma had a chance at a good life?" Ekene felt a pang of guilt, her words hitting him deeply. But even though he understood her worry, he couldn't ignore the voice inside him that told him he had done the right thing. He had defended his dignity, his sister, and all the other kids who were too scared to stand up to Nandy. He took a deep breath and looked at his mother, his voice calm but determined. "Mama, I know you are worried, but I didn't throw anything away. I did what I had to do. All my life, I've seen you work so hard, day and night, to provide for us. I didn't want to come home every day knowing I bowed down to someone who was wrong just because she had power. I'm sorry, but I couldn't do that. His mother sighed, pressing her hand to her forehead. But Aken, what will you do now? Without school, what kind of future will you have? You are throwing away everything, and for what? Just to keep your pride? He shook his head. It's not just pride, Mama. It's about being true to myself, and it's not like I don't have a plan. He glanced down the road, a small smile appearing on his face. I've been helping Uncle Uchenna fix cars for years now. You know he taught me a lot, and I'm good at it. I can work with him, and I'll make enough money to take care of you and Adamma. We'll be okay, Mama. I promise you. We will never suffer. His mother's eyes softened, but she still looked uncertain. She shook her head slowly, her voice a mix of sadness and disbelief. Aken, fixing cars, it's hard work. It's long hours, and there's no guarantee. I wanted you to have more than that, more than this life I have. Don't you see that? Aken reached for her hand, his gaze steady. Mama, I understand. I know you wanted us to have more, but this is something I know I can do. She looked down at their joined hands, the strength of her boy's grip surprising her. He was still so young, barely old enough to know what he was stepping into, yet his words carried a kind of calm that she had never heard from him before. A tear rolled down her cheek and she pulled him into a tight hug. Aken, my son, you are so much like your late father, she murmured, strong, stubborn, and confident. I just hope this path brings you the happiness you are looking for. But remember, no matter what, you'll always have me. Aken hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her embrace, the love and worry wrapped up in every beat of her heart. I promise, Mama, I won't let you down. Back at school, Aken's expulsion was the talk of every corridor. One slap and he was gone. Teachers whispered about it, some guilty but silent, knowing no other school would take him. The message was clear. Nandy had won and no one dared cross her. Her control tightened. Teachers ensured she passed, even though she was the poorest performer. The students watched in fear and Adamma could barely escape her. Nandy soon roped Adamma back in, forcing her to run errands and do her homework, an obedient reminder to everyone of Nandy's power. Meanwhile, Aken, now 17, found his footing with Uncle Uchenna in the workshop. Skilled and focused, he drew more customers, their extra income finally allowing his mother to leave her second job. Life at home grew warmer, dinners filled with smiles and hope. Yet, in the back of his mind, Aken couldn't shake his worry for Adamma. Every time he tightened a bolt or fixed a flat, he promised himself that one day he'd make things right. His journey was far from over. He was building a future his own way. It started like any other class, with the new teacher, Mr. Bello, calling out scores from the recent test. He was still unfamiliar with the faces in the room, and when he reached the bottom 10, he called the names without looking up. Here's a Nandy, 12%, he announced, moving down his list as he continued calling out the lowest scores. A few students tried to stifle giggles. Nandy, seated near the front, froze in shock. No one had dared to announce her grades publicly before. But here was this new teacher, so clueless that he didn't even know who she was. Nandy's eyes narrowed, her face darkening with anger as she noticed the slight smiles and murmured laughs around her. She rose from her seat, shooting a cold glare across the room. Her voice cut through the whispers. You, and you, and you, come here. Kneel at the front, hands on your heads. She pointed at the students who had dared to sneak her. The room fell silent, and the students exchanged nervous glances, hesitating. Mr. Bello, noticing the commotion, looked up in surprise. Young lady, what do you think you are doing? He asked, his tone calm but firm. Nandy crossed her arms, defiance written all over her face. They laughed at me, she replied sharply. They deserve to kneel. And you, she added, her tone cold, you should join them. A chuckle escaped Mr. Bello as he glanced around the room, thinking it was some sort of joke. Very funny. Now take your seat, he said, waving her back. But Nandy didn't move. She remained standing, her jaw clenched, staring him down. The students she'd called forward stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Mr. Bello, seeing the tense looks, became impatient, gesturing for everyone to return to their seats. Just then, Nandy snapped her fingers, calling her new errand girl to come forward. She leaned in, whispering something into her ear. Without a word, the errand girl darted out of the classroom, her expression tense. Moments later, the principal walked into the room, his face showing a mixture of caution and frustration. He took in the scene. Nandy standing with a cold glare, the teacher looking bewildered, and the students kneeling at the front of the class. "What's going on here?" the principal asked, his eyes darting between Mr. Bello and Nandy. "Sir, I was simply trying to restore order," Mr. Bello started, when Nandy interrupted him, her voice dripping with disdain. "He disrespected me, sir," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "He humiliated me in front of the class." The principal's face tightened, and to Mr. Bello's shock, he didn't reprimand Nandy. Instead, he glanced at her with the respect reserved for authority, and gave Mr. Bello a warning look, as if silently advising him to comply. Mr. Bello's smile faded, replaced by confusion and a creeping sense of betrayal. He looked at Nandy, who smirked with satisfaction. Nandy whispered to her errand girl again, who quickly returned with a large bucket of thick green paint from the art room. Nandy lifted the bucket, her eyes meeting Mr. Bello's with a daring, taunting look. "Now, Mr. Bello," she sneered, "why don't you kneel like I told you?" Mr. Bello looked from her to the principal, hoping for a signal to stand his ground, but the principal merely looked away. Realizing he had no support, Mr. Bello's heart sank. Humiliated and out of options, he reluctantly knelt on the cold classroom floor. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop as Nandy lifted the bucket. In one swift motion, she tilted it forward, letting the thick green paint fall over Mr. Bello's head. His face contorted in shock, his mouth open as the paint dripped down his face, into his mouth and soaked his clothes, pulling on the floor. The paint oozed down his neck and hands, staining everything it touched. One brave student, hiding her phone behind a book, recorded the entire scene. The class watched in stunned silence, some students biting their lips to keep from crying, others looking away in discomfort. This was beyond anything they had ever seen. That video soon found its way onto social media, spreading like wildfire. By the next morning, it was everywhere, accompanied by the headline, "Senator's Daughter Humiliates Teacher While the Principal Watches." The response from the public was swift and brutal. A whole senator's daughter bullying a teacher? How does he even allow this? This is what unchecked privilege looks like. Is this who we want leading us? I heard she got kids expelled too. This girl is a menace. The senator, seeing the scandal threatening his reputation, scrambled to do damage control. He summoned Mr. Bello to his office. "I know my daughter can be difficult," he began, feigning sincerity. "But this is all a misunderstanding, don't you think? She wouldn't act this way without provocation." "Your daughter needs consequences, not cover-ups," he replied firmly. "And so do you, Senator," Mr. Bello replied, refusing to listen to the senator. The senator's frustration only grew as he was called to a live national interview. Sitting under the bright studio lights, he tried to maintain his calm, smiling confidently as he downplayed the incident. "My daughter is well behaved," he insisted. "This was a minor misunderstanding, and I have reason to believe that the teacher overreacted. Nandy was only defending herself." The reporter leaned forward, eyes piercing, refusing to let him evade the truth. "Senator, the footage shows your daughter pouring paint on her teacher in front of a classroom of witnesses. How do you explain that?" Caught off guard, the senator stumbled over his words. The carefully rehearsed excuses fell apart, and he fumbled through a weak explanation that left viewers unconvinced. They saw through the lies, and by the time the interview aired, the damage was irreversible. At home, Nandy sat alone in her room, scrolling through an endless stream of comments. Each one hit her harder than the last. What kind of psycho does this to a teacher? Spoiled, entitled brat, She deserves to be expelled. A bully raised by a bully. Disgraceful. Anger boiled inside her. She threw her phone aside. Meanwhile, the senator faced meeting after meeting, each one more exhausting than the last, as he struggled to keep his career afloat. The backlash was relentless, and he could feel his grip on his position slipping. Finally, he returned home one evening, weary and defeated. Nandy was waiting for him, ready to launch into yet another tirade about how unfairly she'd been treated. "Dad, they're treating me like a criminal. It's that teacher's fault." But her father finally snapped, his voice loud and bitter. "Enough, Nandy. Do you know what you've done? You've ruined everything. My career, my name, our family's reputation, all because you couldn't control yourself." Nandy looked at him, stunned. She had never seen him this furious, and had never felt such disappointment from him. His face was red, his eyes hard. In a voice that shook with frustration, he said, "For the first time, I wish you weren't my daughter." Nandy's heart dropped. Her father, the one who had always protected her, always excused her, had turned against her. She sat stunned as he stormed out of the room. The senator, for a brief moment, believed he had escaped the storm. Despite the scandal surrounding his daughter, his powerful friends had rallied around him, helping to silence the noise and keep his career afloat. To him, it was only a minor setback. He brushed it off as just the foolish actions of a child. He felt relieved, even a bit triumphant, knowing he could return to his life as if nothing had happened. But while the senator celebrated, his political opposing parties were at work. Mr. Bello had watched the viral video, reliving his humiliation. Mr. Bello was invited for an interview on national TV, where he decided to tell his story. The interviewer looked at him with gentle curiosity, sensing the weight he carried. When asked how he felt about what had happened, Mr. Bello took a shaky breath, his voice thick with emotion. "I have children of my own," he began, his voice cracking. "To be humiliated by a child like that, for the world to see." He trailed off, a tear slipping down his cheek. He looked directly at the camera, his pain raw, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't explain how much it hurt." The interviewer leaned in, sympathy in her eyes. "And you haven't been back to that school since then?" Mr. Bello shook his head, the memory of the senator's threats still fresh in his mind. "No, I haven't, and there's a reason for that," he said, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket. "There's something the public needs to see." The interviewer watched as the screen switched to the video stored on the USB. The recording showed the senator in Mr. Bello's office, his voice smooth but cold. "Take the money," the senator said, his voice echoing through the studio speakers. "My daughter would never do anything unprovoked. If you don't accept this, I have the power to make sure you never walk a day in your life." The video ended and a shocked silence filled the studio. The senator, watching from his office, felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full weight of what Mr. Bello had exposed. He could feel his career slipping away, his influence crumbling. The public's response was immediate and unforgiving. Comments flooded social media and news outlets, with people demanding accountability. They were enraged by the senator's arrogance, his disregard for others, and the threats he had made to protect his daughter. Mr. Bello went on to share more. "I learned about a boy, Aken," he told the interviewer, his voice trembling, "before I even came to this school. I heard a rumor, a boy expelled for defending himself against Nandy. He slapped her back after she humiliated him and his sister, and instead of justice, he was punished, his life disrupted, his future nearly destroyed." The words struck a chord with the audience. People listened in stunned silence, absorbing the layers of pain Nandy and her father had caused. The news hit hard, and the fallout was swift. The senator's reputation was irreparably damaged, and the public demanded justice. The school principal, who had turned a blind eye to Nandy's cruelty for years, was also forced to resign, unable to bear the weight of his own complicity. As the news spread, people from all over reached out to help Aken. the boy who had stood up to Nandy. The state offered him compensation for the year he lost, and well-known car companies, inspired by his confidence and talent for fixing cars, began offering him scholarships. Ekene's life took a turn he hadn't expected, one that was finally full of hope and possibility. People everywhere were demanding justice, calling for those in power to finally be held accountable. For too long, they had seen leaders protect themselves and their families, sweeping their wrongdoings under the rug, and it seemed like Nandy and her father would be no different. But this time was different. The public was relentless, refusing to let this story fade. Every student who had been bullied by Nandy, every teacher she had assaulted, and even her old friends who had suffered under her cruelty were encouraged to come forward. They shared their stories, and each one painted a damning picture of the life Nandy had led. People watched, horrified and angry, as the stories piled up, revealing the truth of the privilege and power that had shielded her. In court, the jury listened carefully, their faces hard and unreadable. It was clear they wanted to set an example with Nandy's case, a message that no one, not even the daughter of a powerful senator, could escape justice. When the verdict was read, a hush fell over the courtroom. Nandy was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention, followed by 2 years of community service. The decision was swift, the message clear. As officers approached to take her into custody, Nandy's cold bravado broke. Tears streamed down her face as she turned, calling out, "Father, please don't let them take me." But her father, standing in the back of the courtroom, didn't move. His face was tired, his gaze empty. He had lost his career, his influence, and his respect, all because of the cruelty he had allowed in his own home. He looked at her, his lips pressed in a hard line, but he said nothing. "Father, please." Nandy's cries echoed through the silent courtroom, but her father had turned away, and the officers led her out. The ride to the detention center was filled with a silence that felt like lead. Nandy stared out the window, her heart racing, her mind unable to grasp the reality of what was happening. She felt like she was in a nightmare, yet there was no waking up from this. When they arrived, the officers led her through the grey, dimly lit halls, their footsteps echoing off the cold concrete walls. Her heart pounded faster with each step, her hands trembling as they reached the cell that would be hers. One of the guards unlocked the door and gestured for her to enter. As soon as she stepped inside, the iron door clanged shut behind her, leaving her trapped in a small, narrow cell with barely enough space to turn around. She backed up against the wall, breathing hard, fear clawing at her chest. She was no longer the senator's daughter, no longer the untouchable girl who could make others kneel at her command. A few minutes passed before the cell door opened again, and 2 older girls stepped in. They looked at her with mocking smiles, their expressions a mix of amusement and cold satisfaction. "Well, look who's here," one of them sneered, crossing her arms. The senator's spoiled little princess. The other girl leaned closer, her face inches from Nandy's. "I saw you on TV," she said with a smirk, "pouring paint on your teacher, thinking you're better than everyone else." Her eyes gleamed with sarcasm. "How's that working out for you now?" Nandy's heart hammered in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She backed up against the wall, her hands shaking as she tried to press herself away from them. "Aw, look at her," the first girl taunted, her voice dripping with false pity. "Is the big bad bully scared now? Guess what, princess? Nobody cares who you are in here." The 2 girls took a step closer, their eyes cold and unfeeling, their laughter low and cruel. Nandy's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a wave of panic rise inside her. She turned, screaming for the female warden she had seen earlier, her voice breaking with desperation. But there was no response, only silence. She was alone, left to face the consequences of the life she had chosen, with no one to save her. The last sound that echoed through the cold grey walls of the cell was Nandy's cry, a cry that went unheard, a cry that no one cared to answer. The end.